everyone, and welcome to today's program, Legal and Psychodynamic Perspectives on AI Adoption in Entertainment, Risks, Realities, and Responsible Use. I'm Ala Policastro, Director of Education and Professional Development at Beverly Hills Bar Association. This program is presented by BHBA's Entertainment Law section, which is sponsored by Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company. For 5 decades, Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company has been the only California-based company to continuously provide lawyers throughout the state with professional liability insurance coverage. Their experience and expertise are complemented by the fact that LMIC is directed by a group of dedicated lawyers. They offer special rates with competitive premiums for a wide range of areas of practice, including entertainment law. You can learn more about them at lawyersmutual.com. And now I am delighted to introduce our speakers for the day, Dr. Alexander Stein and David Shraga, Esquire. Dr. Stein is the founder and managing principal of Dolus Advisors, a consultancy specializing in psychologically complex enterprise challenges. Trained and licensed as a psychoanalyst, Dr. Stein advises CEOs, senior management teams, and boards across a broad range of industries on leadership, culture, governance, ethics, risk, and organizational matters with complex psychological dimensions. He is also an internationally regarded authority on human risk and the psychodynamics of fraud. He serves on the advisory boards of several technology firms where he consults on human-centered technologies and their unintended consequences. Dr. Stein is widely published and currently contributes his expertise to Forbes, focusing on the psychology of decision-making and unintended consequences in the organizations and societies. And David Shraga, he is a private mediator specializing in entertainment, media, and intellectual property. With more than 20 years of experience across the Hollywood ecosystem, he brings a rare perspective as a neutral, having worked previously as both a trial lawyer and senior studio executive. His in-house roles included SVP and Head of Global Television Business and Legal Affairs at Miramax, VP of Business and Legal Affairs for NBC Universal's International Television Studios, and Senior Counsel for Legal Affairs at Universal Pictures. He's a member of the Executive Committee of the Entertainment Law section at Beverly Hills Bar Association, serves as a volunteer mediator for the Los Angeles Superior Court, and volunteers with California Lawyers for the Arts and the Western Center on Law and Poverty. We can't wait to hear what they have to share with us today, so I'm going to turn it over to them.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ala, for those very generous introductions. It's really our pleasure to be here today. And Alexander, it's really a pleasure to share the stage with you as well. Welcome.
Likewise, David. This is great.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, this first slide just gives an overview of our topic today, but maybe we could take this down and jump into our conversation. Alexander, I thought it would be worthwhile to start by just noting what a really truly unique perspective it is, I think, that you bring to this conversation based on your expertise. Lawyers, and I think particularly entertainment lawyers, oftentimes find themselves dealing with complicated emotional situations, psychologically complicated situations. And I think that your perspective as someone who advises boards, CEOs, senior management about how to navigate these types of situations, how your background in psychoanalytic training and how that affects decision-making and human behavior is a really valuable perspective for this conversation today, and really for our audience who might not even realize that this type of resource is out there for their clients. So tell me if I got all that right. I want to make sure that I captured things correctly.
Well, you certainly captured my bona fides correctly, but I think the most important thing to underscore is that people are at the center of all of these activities. And my contention is that the more we understand about the people, what goes on for them, what their assets and deficiencies or blind spots may be, the more we can do to help move things along to better outcomes for all involved.
Yeah, I think that's a great point and really helpful perspective on the big picture of why we're here today, which is to try and be helpful in exploring these subjects and talking about sort of the risks and the benefits, but also this broader concept that we talk about a lot in the industry today, which is responsible use. And I think that there's an intersection between AI, between the industry, between the concepts that you've just described in terms of it being a people-centered business. And so I think it's going to be a really fun conversation today. And one thing I would mention as well is that As we talk about this, we appreciate that this is a complicated and nuanced topic, and there are different perspectives around AI adoption and how we think about human creativity, in particular in the context of using these tools. You just need to pull up, the trades on any given day where they're talking about, union negotiations and the intersection of these issues. And so I just wanted to say to our audience, we really welcome your participation in this discussion today. There's a Q&A. Feel free to place your questions in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to try and address them. I mean, ideally, I think as we go in connection with the topics that we are going through. So, with that, I'll say let's get into it. So, right, big picture wise, AI is impacting Hollywood and the industry in ways that are profound. And we see this intersection between legal and psychological issues and this overlap. It affects a wide range of stakeholders, from lawyers to artists to studios to technologists who are involved in these businesses. The questions we're dealing with are novel and complex, right? They're issues that we have never grappled with before in this industry, notwithstanding that it's an industry that has historically always embraced new technologies, right? The entertainment industry exists because there's this union of technological advancement and creative artistry. But we're talking about something a little bit different now, right? The dialogue around AI is there's definitely a very strong feeling that there are threats to people's professions and to their livelihoods, as well as to really well-established understandings of what it is that artists do and what it means to create and even what art is. And these are some fundamental questions, I think, that we're going to try and dig into a little bit today. Hollywood's always been about movie magic, right? But generative AI technologies and general artificial intelligence, it feels like we're talking about something different. So maybe we could start with me asking you, what is unique and different about what's happening in the entertainment industry context today when we talk about these tools?
So if I may, David, before I actually dig into your question, I think it will be helpful for the audience if I frame a little bit more about my perspectives and even some of my biases around some of these issues, so that it clarifies what my value add is here.
Great.
Right. So to begin with, a lot of the things that I'm going to say will sound as if I'm anti-technology. I am not. I'm not a tech maximalist, which are groups of people who promote artificial intelligence, be aggressively integrated into every facet of life. But I'm also not a technophobe or a troglodyte about it. Technology is enormously important. Technological innovation is crucial to the world and to society. Certainly, it is intrinsic to Hollywood. I'm a big fan. I'm also a real advocate for responsible technology and unwaveringly questioning the step between can we and should we, and to always prudentially considering unintended consequences. So that being said, let me just tell a quick story that establishes really what I'll be focusing on here today. So imagine a vessel containing a parchment, essentially a message in a bottle, right? And it's discovered by an advanced being that has this remarkable technology that is capable of analyzing every single facet of it. So the biochemical and microcellular composition of the vessel and the parchment and the ink, and all of it is dated and located and correlated into the database of universal history, and they decipher the symbols and translate its meaning. And absolutely every single thing about it is completely understood, except what it was like to be the person who wrote the message. And that is my primary role in this conversation, is to keep our attention on, in essence, the person who wrote the note. What is it like to be human as we enter into this realm in which technology seems to be taking over everything and in some respects even threatening to supplant the human in what has heretofore been a quintessentially human enterprise. So that, I think, helps to encapsulate where we're going to go together in this conversation that really is at the intersection of lawyers attempting to navigate all of these novel and complicated and nuanced issues that are neither purely legal and commercial nor purely psychological. We're trying to contend with things in a very dynamic state here.
Well, let me just jump in and say I appreciate you explaining that. We're talking about sort of entertainment and the legal profession right now, but I think everything that you said can be sort of writ large more broadly across the entire debate relating to AI. And there is certainly a broader conversation going on about how there is this narrative about the importance of AI and the importance of advancing the technology and moving things forward. And I think that we've talked about this many times, which is that the conversation has to acknowledge that this is a fundamental aspect of what's going on in our culture. It's not going away. It's an extraordinarily powerful tool, and there's tremendous benefits that are available. Mm-hmm. But to your point, there's a question of there's an element to the dialogue about the importance of getting there the fastest. Right. And I think that race can lead people to not necessarily pay as much attention to the question of is how should we get there? Right. Or should we be doing certain things? Or what are the concerns that we should be keeping in mind?
Indeed. And as we dive into our conversation, one of the things that I'll be continually emphasizing is the chain of causality there, that there are any number of things where we can say, well, this is happening because of, and fill in the blank. And that may be true or valid, but isn't necessarily the entire reason. So there are a lot of forces at play here in the rush to achieve certain things without properly considering what happens if that occurs, and are there certain things that can be done about it. So just to put a finer note on what maybe I should acknowledge as something of a bias is that one soapbox that I'm going to be on today is to encourage the legal professionals who are in attendance to consider what their roles are as sentries of not just contracts and the rule of law, but their place in society at the front lines in having an important function in trying to determine where things go or how quickly or slowly they go there, and that keeping an eye on society at large and the creative industry, not just clients' desires and wants and needs, is always at play here and not just necessarily in the background.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important point, when it comes to sort of what is the attorney in context of representation of clients, and when it comes to dealing with these issues. I mean, fundamentally, as lawyers, we identify issues, right, and we advise and we present options, and sort of to get to down to the level that we're talking about here today in terms of the entertainment industry and a seminar that's going to benefit attorneys as we talk about these issues, from the perspective of an entertainment lawyer, someone who deals with lots of these types of disputes and tries to follow what's going on. I think that lawyers really, they address contentious and difficult emotional things on behalf of actual parties, issues that affect society. Entertainment lawyers in particular, I think, are more than just paper pushers. I'm not to denigrate any of the lawyers, but my point is to say is they're advisors to creative artists as well as to studios and businesses. And, I think that you can think about this, the role of an entertainment lawyer from multiple perspectives or multiple levels. And I think it can also get complicated because there's a couple different levels to being an entertainment lawyer. On the one hand, you're there to help your clients thrive and work, right? If you work at a boutique and your clients are artists, you're working on helping them find these opportunities and make a living, right? So there's a real business and financial component to it. But you're also supporting their growth and creativity, right? And you're constantly in this dialogue now, in particular, about how they are engaging with and struggling with these issues about AI and how this technology is coming into the business. On the studio side, right, they're very conscious of trying to support artists and creators and create great environments in order to bring in the best talent, and also how do we use these tools to create efficiencies and to deal with the difficult economic pressures that studios are facing in this ecosystem. And we talked before about how there's a strong sentiment and a concern that AI is replacing job opportunities, and it's something that is front and center, as we said, in these guild negotiations that are starting up again. There's a lot of artists, obviously, that are very eager to embrace these technologies and to use them to create, and they come to their lawyers to say, "How do I do it?" And there's almost this tension that exists at dinner parties between the people who are on one side of the debate and the people who are on the other, and they don't necessarily want to feel that they're going to be cast out because of it. And I think it's made even more complicated because it's not really black and white anymore. 20 years ago, if you were in the entertainment industry and you represented talent or the studio side. And what you're finding now is that, lots of creative artists are forming studios of their own, and they're creating business of their own with the intention specifically of using this technology. There's Darren Aronofsky's company, Primordial Soup, and Natasha Lyonne, and Ben Affleck, right? There's just in the news about selling Interpositive to Netflix for $600 million. And so, there's a graying between how you struggle with these issues and advise your clients about them. But I think that fundamentally, it comes back to something you said already and something that's in the title of our presentation, which is it's a conversation around responsible use, right? And I do think that is the primary thing that lawyers need to be thinking about at the intersection of this debate.
Yeah, agreed.
So let's pop up our next slide here. We've got some chapter headings that we're going to be using to guide our conversation today. And then we'll let this just sink in for a moment. A little food for thought for the audience. And let's talk about the difference between computational systems, what these large language models do, and how human beings operate and process, shall we say, and why it matters. So maybe we can bring down the slide and get going with our conversation. So you have written an article that's entitled "Computation is Not Mentation: Why Embodiment and Lived Experience Matter." And I think the topic will really resonate with artists in particular who are thinking about these issues and where creativity comes from. And we'll get into that as well. But what would you sort of share with the audience in terms of the core takeaways from this piece about computation versus mentation, sort of as the fundamental concept?
Yeah, so that article, which I wrote and published last year, is a natural extension of a piece that I published in Forbes in 2019, titled "The Pitfalls of Outsourcing Self-Awareness to AI." And just as a parenthesis here, since there are a lot of lawyers in the audience, I should correct how I was introduced. I am not currently writing for Forbes. That was that was in the past. In any case, that 2019 article focused on the paradigm shift in the dominant principles governing human tool making and innovation in recorded history, where we started by making things of necessity, really, to assist us and enhance our lives and do things that we couldn't, to today, where we're developing tools basically so we don't have to do certain things, and even more concerningly, that have a core purpose to tell us something about ourselves. So we have tools that assess and surveil and predict and manage aspects of human thought and emotion and behavior. And so we are, in essence, especially with contemporary and frontier AI systems, outsourcing aspects of self-agency. So I was motivated to put pen to paper on computation is not mentation, because as the frenzy around AI deployment and adoption started to really crest recently, it occurred to me that it only made sense from my perspective that technologists would be enormously interested in, if not have an imperative, to understand the human mind, since the central project of AI is really to emulate human thought in some way, like human decision making. Um, it turns out that I was the only person who thought that. um, but the net of that is that AI has continued to develop, essentially as kind of like a thalidomide baby, really. Like it is utterly lacking in some fundamental features and misshapen understandings around how we actually think and how we actually make decisions, right? So it has a severely limited model of mental architecture that super privileges cognition and leaves out almost everything else that's really crucial to how our minds work. In particular, embodied experience, affect, which is emotion, attachment, childhood development, interiority, which is everything that goes on inside us, and subjective history. So, if I may take a few minutes here, I want to give a brief high velocity primer on what it is to be human.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to dig into this, right? Because I think these considerations filter directly into what we're talking about when it comes to what it means to create, right? And what are the psychosocial issues around creation? So please continue.
Yeah, I think not just for purposes of this conversation, but certainly so, to be able to discuss what we're talking about, which are the socio-technical components of the technology. Um, it, there really does need to be at least a foundational understanding of what the psychosocial components are really made of.
And can I ask, so just from a top level definitional perspective, can you just sort of describe what you mentioned cognition, that AI models are very good at cognition, but not at these other internal architectural aspects, but cognition versus mentation, what is the fundamental definitional difference?
Cognition really refers to the idea of like a brain in a vat, like what a computer does. It computes data, right? We understand mathematical processes. If, 1 + 1 =, and we know what the answer is, that's a form of cognitive processing.
Mhm.
Um, Mentation refers to, and perhaps it's really more a term of art in a way, but it refers to mental life, like all of the different mental processes, not just the cortical functions that give rise to decision making, but everything that goes through our minds when we're thinking about something. And this is pertinent for really all decision making, even so-called purely cognitive or logistical or rational ones, but absolutely central in all things creative.
The core of what it means to be human, to have this soup basically swirling up there.
Yes, very much so. So, um, really, in simplest terms, we can talk about the way in which what we're discussing as intelligence, whether it's artificial intelligence or human intelligence, really is the iterative byproduct of our early development and the accumulated influences and impact and the nature and quality of primary relationships, our environments, and our experiences. So it's really the multitude of micro moments that give rise to who each of us is. The unique amalgam of being alive in our bodies, in our relationships to mortality, and in relationships to others, and they with us. So, by contrast, to consider that AI systems have no understanding in the way that we use and define that word of anything, right? They can't reason or plan or exercise common sense. They don't comprehend. There's no empathy or care. There's no emotions. There are no relationships. There's no experience of relationships. There's no past or memory. There's no intrinsic drives to do or not do anything. They don't want anything. There's no desire. Essentially, AI lacks the foundational and centrally constitutive elements of everything that governs how everyone but technologists understand how we think and operate in the field and in the world. And so that's a problem if you're trying to develop systems that are essentially human-like in their result, because we're tasking computational systems to intervene in aspects of human affairs, or even to act as if they were human in many ways, where those kinds of performance deficiencies are fatal.
So I want to follow up on that point about those deficiencies being fatal, but let me ask sort of maybe what seems like sort of a basic question about this, which is, I think that perhaps the question from the other side would be, well, we're on a spectrum, right? And we've seen tremendous development and progress in what these models can do in a short period of time. And it seems like there's leaps and bounds, and there's been this sort of algorithmic growth, right, that we talk about. At the same time, you have folks like Dario Amodei from Anthropic talking about that curve is going to level off. And maybe the layperson's question would be, if we're on a spectrum and we're early in the process of developing these models, is there a way that these models can continue to train, to learn, to ingest the sum of human knowledge and experience to start to recreate these types of qualities? Or I think that your answer is going to be there's a fundamental difference here in what we're talking about. We see it play out probably in things like how these chatbots are speaking with folks, and we have, terrible tragedies that happen. But at the same time, we see a tremendous advancement in what these models seem to be capable of doing on an interactive level.
Well, yeah, I mean, you gave the answer. My job here is done. Yes, the capabilities are truly impressive and astonishing, and the ways in which these systems can, it seems, ingest and return the compendium of human knowledge is non-trivial. However, it is all artifice. It is a simulacrum. There is nothing there that gives rise to any dimensionality of understanding of what it is. It is just a regurgitation that comes in a form that we can relate to, and relatability is of primary concern in user experience for these systems. And so as LLMs and algorithms have developed the capability to bring to us something that we can say, oh, that's pretty close to what I'm used to, fosters what we're seeing, which is the formation of relationships with silicon. And, so here we are in the entertainment industry where it actually seems like a plausible conversation that, writers and actors can be replaced by digitized avatars of some sort, right? So I think one question is, what happens if that happens? I think a fundamental question that we can toy around with today but won't answer is, why would we do that? Actually, right? To what end?
Yeah.
But my perspective for this conversation, which is limited only by the time that we have, not by what I can say, is that in many respects, it parallels movie magic in itself, right? That there are a lot of things that you see on the screen that we suspend disbelief about, and we immerse ourselves in the aesthetic experience that's presented in the drama or the comedy or whatever it is, the universe on the film, and we are in it. That is a part of what we can do as humans. That is actually a creative act that we all share, which is a part of what makes the industry live. And so we can mistake artifice for the real, but it isn't real. And so what's happening is a form of pretend reality. And so it seems to me really that one of the questions that we are that we really must contend with ultimately is, what does it say about us as a society that we seem willing to go there, right? If we understand that so much of art, and certainly a lot of the movies and theater, are representations of certain things that are at play in society at a given moment, not just for the artist who creates it, then our involvement with artificiality in this way, in creativity at scale, is a mirror of something about where we are right now.
Yeah, it's a powerful point, and the broader question of what does it say about us if we're talking about a replacement of these aspects of human creativity in the ways that we're describing, and I think this is the conversation that's happening, right? And our next slide, maybe we can flash it for a moment, was going to sort of be on the topic of creativity, and I think, Alexander, you tell me, I think we may have sort of hit on a lot of, I think, the points that you would have wanted to raise and we would have discussed around this as well. My point was going to be is, there's one aspect of the conversation that is focused on the potential promise of this technology to create. And there is this temptation to say, well, if you ask AI to write a screenplay or you give it some basic prompts and it can spit out something that's, seems okay, not so bad, right? And there's a lot more to be said about that. But one of the things that you hear a lot, for example, when you have the head of SAG, right? You've got Sean Astin on stage talking at Comic-Con, or not Comic-Con, at the CES conference, or maybe with Duncan Crabtree Ireland has given these types of talks also about what the issues are that are important to the guilds. Is, they talk about the critical role of human beings in creating, and why that there could be a category of creation that is really sort of more in the vein of prompted and AI generated, but that the role of human beings in this process is critical in terms of actors and writers, and you have all sorts of talent who's talking about this also. And I think that one of the things that I find really interesting about your perspective and your background on this is, from a psychological and psychoanalytic perspective, there's this question of why do we create? Right. And I think that maybe we could flash this next slide for a moment. And I think that, fundamentally, when we have this conversation, and I think when we talk about the importance of authenticity and people being involved in these processes, there's sort of an intuitive feeling around what it means to create and where it comes from. But maybe tell me if you think this is a good time to talk about this slide, and I can hand it over to you.
Yes. I'll tell you what, since you have the slide up, let me just introduce why it's here and what it's going to be, and then we can play the short clip, and then we can take the slide down and I'll talk a little bit more, or a lot more, about, what actually is creativity.
What it is, and why we do it as human beings, I think, is the corollary that's so important to keep in mind.
Indeed. All right. So as the slide says, and probably everyone knows, the Whale started out as a play that was produced by Playwrights Horizons in 2012, written by Sam Hunter, that was made into a film by Darren Aronofsky in 2022, which won numerous awards, including Brendan Fraser as Best Actor, who was just really astonishing. But Shuler Hensley was the actor who originated the role on stage. And one of the reasons that I've selected this clip, which is from the stage production for this conversation, is it just beautifully, really powerfully and intensely underscores so many of the issues at play, which I want to elaborate a little bit in the moments that follow the clip. So if we can play that now, please.
In the first part of his book, the author, calling himself Ishmael, is in a small seaside town, and he's sharing a bed with a man named Queequeg. The author and Queequeg go to church and hear a sermon about Jonah, and later set out on a ship captained by the pirate Ahab, who is missing a leg and very much wants to kill a whale, which is named Moby Dick, and which is white. In the course of this book, the pirate Ahab encounters many hardships. His entire life is set around trying to kill a certain whale. I think this is sad because the whale has no emotion and doesn't know how bad Ahab wants to kill him. He's just a poor, big animal. I feel bad for Ahab as well because he thinks his life will be better if he can just kill this whale. But in reality, it won't help him at all. This book made me think about my own life. This book made me think about my own life. This book made me think about my own life.
All right, let's take down the slide. Powerful.
Yeah. So AI could generate that text, I suppose, if you prompted it, but it couldn't write that. And it couldn't perform that. That is art in every respect.
Well, when I see it, and I will confess that I never saw The Whale, and I didn't know the origin of that work, and I don't know this performer, but there is an intensity to it, and I find myself wondering things like, who is this guy, and what was his life? And I notice, his hair and his way of delivering the line and the intensity in his eyes. And I think that going back to the big picture point about what does AI do? What do these models do? And what is the difference between that and human creation? This guy is an N of one, right? In terms of being a unique person with a unique perspective that he brings to his art. And, is there a way to teach a model to do that or to generate something like that randomly or spontaneously? And I think, it's hard to fathom that. But it's also hard for me to think, would it have the same emotional connection for me watching that without thinking about the unique perspective of the artist on stage who's doing that?
Connection is perhaps the operative word. It may be possible at some point for these systems to produce something that is just dazzlingly evocative of things in ways that it can't now, because in the grand scheme of its development, it's probably still pretty primitive. But I would contend that it cannot create that or perform that for all of the reasons I've already said so far, and for the thousands of reasons I haven't had a chance to give voice to yet. So, let me say a few things about, what actually is creativity. And, we could talk all day just about that one clip in certain respects, like deconstructing what's actually going on there. It's important to bear in mind, for instance, that when you think about who is that guy, which guy are you referring to actually, right? The actor or the character of Charlie or the playwright who created the character of Charlie, which is actually nothing like his actual life, but which was inspired to become this morbidly obese person as a result of other experiences that he had in his life. And that really is quintessentially so much of what creativity is, right? It's the imaginative extrapolation of life experience into something else. It's a lot more like dreams than the manufacturing process of a product. There's nothing formulaic about it. It's the distortion of myriad aspects of life experience and emotion that come as a confluence into a particular form by virtue of its own astronomical set of reasons why some creative person would choose one art form over another. You know, why writing not dancing, why art not music, right? Like, so why this particular instrument or not that. And so the underpinning drivers, shall we say, of what gives rise for a person to want or to need to do what's required, the work that's necessary to make that art, and what it means to her or to him. And then what happens, to use your word, in connection with other people who then are brought into that world and what that evokes for them. These are all part of the individual and social components of the human experience. And computational systems can ingest the sort of the fundamental structure of what that is, because it will have read, so to speak, everything ever written, and it will scan all of the content, and it will have viewed all of the movies and plays. And so there will be a body of information, but it will not be a corpus of knowledge, and there will be no integrated experience of what it was like, right? It will be the message in the bottle without an understanding of what brought about the writing of the message.
Yeah, when you that story and that example reminds me. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Steven Spielberg's AI,
Sure.
where it's about the young robot boy, right?
Hmm.
And obviously, we could talk a long time about that film and the
Hmm.
capacities of that robot in terms of simulating a child. But at the end of the movie, not to give it away, right? He's trapped in ice and he's discovered by an alien culture
Hmm.
hundreds of years, if not thousands, into the future.
Yeah.
And their takeaway is he actually interacted with a human being, right?
Yeah.
Real memory of what a human being was.
Right. So what is real memory there? Blade Runner 2049 also plays with that trope pretty well, where the replicant is pursuing what he supposes is an actual memory, which means that he is actually biologically created, not synthetically manufactured, and is on this quest to determine if in fact it was an implanted memory, which is a technology that's known in the world of the film at that time, or if it is evidence that it is a memory from his history. And so even in that film world, the AI entities can themselves be self-deceived as to whether or not they actually exist or not, or whether they have a past or not, or whether they actually feel something or not.
It's fascinating. It is the universality we're starting to see to some of these themes through many works but let me sort of go back to something you were talking about, which is, you know, that clip and the reflection of the artist's humanity. And, I think it takes us back to the conversation about uh, you know, responsible use. And it seems like more and more the dialogue in Hollywood, and you hear this from Ben Affleck and from the people whose companies I mentioned, and the conversation is moving into sort of an acknowledgement that AI cannot, should not actually replace filmmakers themselves and their role in the creative process, but that it's a tool to facilitate creativity. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the psychological underpinning of why it is that human beings actually create. And again, I think that on a intrinsic level, uh, people understand this and feel this. But I think your perspective on this, given your training, is really useful, especially for lawyers who are advising clients and dealing with these issues. Because, one of the things that when I talk to lawyers and I speak with deal lawyers about the adoption of this technology and what are the conversations that are going on in their law firms when the clients come in and sit down and talk to them, and what do they say about creativity and their perspective on their work, oftentimes the answer is that that they create because they have to, that it comes from within,
Mhm.
that there's something that they need to express, that they wouldn't know what else to do with themselves if they weren't being an artist, right? And
Mhm.
I think that the question for you is, again, from a psychological perspective, why do human beings create? What function does it serve for us that we shouldn't lose sight of when we're having this conversation?
So the answer that those people are given is correct in its own way, but it's really the equivalent of saying, "Why is water wet? Because it's wet," right? Like it's just a conceptual tautology that doesn't go very far. So to touch on this, because we're actually running out of time
Yeah, let's move.
really fast, and it's almost as if we've just begun, um, is uh, that creativity is born of internal life experience, right? It entails imagination and play, and often like a devotional or even sacrificial effort and rigorous training to execute. Um, it um, it comes about through a drive to convert and express out of oneself internal experiences, sometimes actually very frequently ones that that person might describe as a form of trauma. What was it like not to be loved? What was it like to feel ostracized? What was it like, or what is it like to feel like you're always dismissed or denigrated, or you're deprived, or that who you really feel like you are, no one cares about, or they're just it's an infinite set of permutations at play in terms of what that is. So just like as one quick example to make that a little bit more concrete, the author of The Whale is not fat. And while he did teach, and the character of Charlie is a teacher, he took the idea of what it was like for him to grow up in a particular religious household and to recognize as a young man that his sexual orientation took him outside of the norm for his family and his community in terms of expectations of who he was supposed to be, and embodied that literally into a character that can't really fit anywhere and is killing himself by overeating, and his desperate desire as the play and the film progress to reconnect with empathy with his adult daughter. So it's biographical in the sense that it's generated by the author's life experience, but it's not autobiographical in any direct sense. And so that kind of multi-dimensional, multifaceted extrapolation and distortion of internal life experience and how that is felt by an individual, not just the biographical, factual structures of it, are very much at play. And to throw out a technical concept that has a lot of significance here is sublimation. So sublimation is sort of the use of internal processes as the defense mechanism to take things that are or would be considered socially unacceptable, that have to do with feelings of aggression or something that would be difficult to live out or play out, and transform it into something productive, constructive, and acceptable. So, if you feel hate or you feel, miserable or whatever it is, and basically the world around you is saying, we don't want that, you go away, you keep your mouth shut, don't be you in some way, You can produce a work of art that will garner, the adulation of millions of people, and suddenly you have, in essence, solved a problem, even though it doesn't actually directly solve the originating problem. So, in brief, that's a part of what's going on.
I mean, it's it's a very useful perspective because it really gets to the heart of creativity in the sense that it serves our emotional architecture, right? And our internal ability to process good and bad and to express it and to connect with others. So there's a question in the chat, and I'm not sure if you think this might be a good time for us to
Sure.
address it. Maybe I'll read it out loud, and then you can speak to it. And then I
Oh,
think maybe we can jump through some of our other slides. And I think there's a couple other things we wanted to talk about. But
at least a couple.
yeah, so the question is sort of quote unquote creativity at scale. It's from Jack Russo. He asks, is that impossible? Who is going to convince studios and other owners of capital who are willing to pursue that goal at the same level that Henry Ford a century ago and Elon Musk recently did for auto production? I mean, I think maybe inherent within that question is the notion that AI tools, when applied at scale, um, can really sort of reduce barriers to entry, right? And can empower people to be creative in some sense. But I think probably the flip side of it is if these tools are just acting independently, can they do that as well?
Well, I mean, one could argue you already have creativity at scale. That's what the industry is. So it's not clear to me, what the actual goals are here. What Henry Ford did in terms of creating the capability for more people to have a different kind of vehicle, and to advance out of horse-drawn buggies was incredibly important. But that's not what we're talking about here, really. It's not, it's something of an inaccurate comparison. I'm not even going to touch what the other guy is doing because he's actually a willfully destructive force in lots of ways, notwithstanding the fact that he has some entrepreneurial talents.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I would say, one of the things that I think about with creativity at scale is the ability of these tools to be deployed in such a way that allows more people to create, right? And so, for example, there was this Disney OpenAI deal that had been announced back in December, though recently had been abandoned, and the idea was to give users of the Sora app access to Disney IP in order to create user-generated content
mhm.
based on this IP. So I think there is some notion that fosters creativity at scale in some sense in a new way, but it's not removing the human element of creativity, right? It is basically just providing a tool that can facilitate that. That would be my perspective.
Yeah, but if that were if that were the limit to it, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? So home tape recorders revolutionized the recording industry. There are lots of camcorders and iPhones have enabled people to do things that otherwise were beyond their reach for technical and economic reasons, right? There are lots of things that technology affords that are a boon to all kinds of people who want to make or create. And yes, it does lower the bar of entry to all kinds of activities but we're talking about the industry flirting with the idea of dispensing with people who are actually creating, and replacing them with agents that actually can't do anything more than notionally approximate what's already being done.
Well, and it kind of goes back to the original framing of our conversation, which is there's something different that we're talking about here than the mere adoption of technical tools to advance creativity. Maybe we could run through a couple of these slides, because I think that we've got about 5 minutes or so left, and one of the things that we had talked about is sort of the risk of living in a world of artificiality and sort of part of what we potentially lose. We've talked about what is creativity, why we create, and Suzanne, maybe you could take us to the next clip, and maybe we can run through this one as a as a last stop for us to talk about what we need to hold on to as part of the creative process. This one, you want to do this one, or do you want to do the next one, Alexander?
Yeah, let's do the next one,
Let's do
actually.
All right.
I think that's still misspelled, but whatever.
Ratatouille? They must be joking.
All right, so let's pull this down.
Always sweet to watch that scene.
Yeah,
So,
what is the takeaway from your perspective?
yeah, I mean, the fact that it is a cartoon and not live actors in a way is one attempt to show how close we can come to, in a sense, replacing humans in the process, but not actually supplant them, right? So certain kinds of animation technology was used here, but it's still a work of art that's written and made and voiced by people. And the story itself is informed, and the reason that we're moved by it, even as adults, it's not a kid's movie per se, is because what's happening there is something that we can all relate to, whether it was our experience or something that we longed for. That moment of nostalgia that the film critic Anton Ego experiences when he has that first bite, and it takes him back to his boyhood home, and his mother is there, and she looks at him and touches him, and he has that whole visceral experience of having that food in that moment, and he's just returned to a time and a place that is in him but no longer exists, but there he is in the restaurant. And this is a part of the human experience, and we can be touched by that, and that is one of the functions of art. And computational systems can't do that for all of the reasons that I've stated and many others that I haven't.
Yeah, I mean, it resonates, right? And it draws on the history and the universality of some of these experiences. And I think to your point, even though it is animation, there are people behind it, right?
In
And
it.
in it and behind it and writing it. And, it really kind of, for me, we started out this conversation by saying, the 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 reality is these tools are very powerful and have lots of potential benefits, right?
Yeah.
And there are concerns about replacement of people in these processes and their livelihoods and how it affects their creativity, and not losing sight of what it means to create and why it is important to facilitate that and to value that for human beings as part of the process. And we see these synthetic performers that are out there now, um, and there's lots of criticism of them. But I also think that it's important to keep in mind that behind many of these new sort of synthetic performers or these new forms of expression is prompting, and in some sense, prompting is a fundamentally human creative act that goes into formation of something new that can be used to foster the creative process and to convey these messages in a different medium. And I think there's a lot of a hope within that, as long as we can sort of keep sight of the fact that there's a critical human component to it. And you can have a human component and it may not come out great, right? There's all sorts of
For
content that
sure.
human beings have been creating for a long time that drowns out the great stuff. But it's there and it's important to contribute.
Yeah, well, optimization is not always optimal. One of the things that we didn't really get to, but from a psychoanalytic perspective, the ways in which we end up making often decisions that turn against our intentions or that are against our own interest is significant here. So, responsible use requires a lot of deep thought and consideration. And, there are so many things that we didn't get to. Maybe we'll be afforded another opportunity. I wanted to ask you some questions, not just about responsible use, but also about the legalities of accountability when we're talking about systems that actually could not be held to standards of legal intentionality or anything approximating mens rea, for example. And, what do we do about that from legal, moral, and social perspectives? And, there are just a host of other things that are really crucial to open up and explore here together.
Yeah, the very active dialogue around those issues when it comes to liability and agentic systems and
Mhm.
self-driving vehicles and things like that, and thinking about the safeguards that are in place and the folks behind them.
Mhm.
We talked about, in preparing for today, the importance of thinking about how we think about this in connection with our children and the role of creativity and imagination, the development of children and how they relate to these various tools
Yeah.
and the role of advertising. There's some laws that have been passed in New York about disclosing that there's content created by AI. But I mean, I think that, as a fundamental takeaway, I would say as a lawyer, it's extraordinarily helpful to hear your perspective in terms of the psychological architecture underpinning these dialogues and to understand um, really what internally is animating these conversations, particularly from the artistic community, about why it's important to remember the role of humanity in creation, and at the same time to acknowledge the value of these tools from all aspects of the creative industry in terms of how it can raise the bar and facilitate, the creation of more better content that may not otherwise be have been created. So, any final takeaways from you, or I think we're out of time for today.
Yeah, I think we're out and over time. Maybe I would just underscore my call to action for the audience of lawyers here, which is to really be considerate of the larger human and social issues at play and to do what you can as a guardian, not just of contracts and the law, but of society and, thinking of children, that there are long-term ramifications to the ways in which they are influenced, not just by us as adults, whether they're parents or not, but also by the entertainment industry. It's a very, very impactful sector of society, and the responsibility to ensure that things are done right, not just well, is paramount.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make. It's a great place to leave it. Alexander Stein, thank you so much for your contributions to this dialogue today. It's been fantastic speaking with you.
Likewise, David Shraga, thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Yes.